And welcome to week 12 of business law. This week we're going to take a little foray into the world of what we call secured transactions. Before we get into the material, let's dance a little bit of a jig because praise the Lord, we're done with contracts after, 5, 6 weeks, something like that. Seemed like forever. And we went through contracts, and those are very, very important, but we're going to be moving on to some other topics now. And I think it's good that we spend about a week on this. This material is all about debt, and personally I think debt's an evil thing that you should avoid if at all possible, but it's a fact of life in the world of business. It's hard to run a business without using some debt once in a while. And this week we're going to look at the relationship between debtors and creditors. Sometimes that's a good relationship, sometimes it goes sour, and when people stop making payments on stuff. And so we're going to take a little bit of time and to look at kind of how debt is structured, both with respect to real property and personal property, and also look at the options that the creditor has when the debtor ends up being a deadbeat, and kind of look at those sorts of things that you really ought to know something about if you're going to be a professional in the business world. You probably already know this, but a person who lends money out is a creditor, and the person who is borrowing that money is the debtor. And so we'll be using that terminology quite a bit in here. The world of debt is divided into two broad categories. When you have a debt, it's either going to be secured or unsecured. A secured debt is guaranteed by collateral, or what we would say property which the creditor has a right to take if the debt is not repaid on time. So there's a guarantee there. If the debtor doesn't repay the debt like he's supposed to, the creditor can swoop in and take away some sort of property that's being used to guarantee the debt. An unsecured debt, on the other hand, has no collateral, and so the creditor has no such recourse. Once the debtor's not repaying the bills, there's nothing to go seize because the creditor doesn't have any rights and any property guaranteeing the loan. Let's look at an example now. Ruth decides to start a business, but she has no money. So she takes out a loan so that she will have capital to start her business. The bank wants security on the debt, so Ruth puts up her house as collateral. If she fails to make payments on the loan, then the bank can take her house and sell the house to pay off Ruth's debt. So this is a secured debt. And in this case, the bank is a creditor, and they are called a secured creditor because they are the creditor on secured debt. So here we have the role of collateral comes in if Ruth ends up being a deadbeat. If she doesn't pay her bills, the bank can swoop in and seize the house. And so they have a little safety blanket there, and that will certainly encourage the bank to lend out money if they have that safety net there, if they know that they can go see somebody's house and sell it. If the debtor ends up defaulting on the debt, that makes them a lot more comfortable when they're lending out money. To see how this arrangement's going to work, let's say that Ruth's business fails, and let's see what happens there. So she took out a loan of $200,000 to start her business. After a year, Ruth's business flops and she is unable to keep repaying the loan. She has only paid back $20,000 of the money she borrowed, so she still owes $180,000. So the bank forecloses on Ruth's house, taking it to satisfy the debt. The bank sells the house, but the house only sells for $150,000. That means that even after her house is gone, Ruth is still going to owe the bank $30,000. The bank goes to court and gets what's called a deficiency judgment for the amount of money Ruth still owes. Then the bank can take its judgment and seize other assets belonging to Ruth, such as her car, her bank accounts, or other property she happens to own. If Ruth works and takes home a paycheck, the bank can garnish or seize part of her wages to pay the debt. So they can take that deficiency judgment to Ruth's boss and say, look, Ruth owes us a debt, and start, instead of giving her full paycheck, send part of it to us. And so that's what happens when your wages are garnished, and that's not a good thing. And so if Ruth goes belly up here, the bank has lots of options. They have the house, certainly, but if that's not enough, of course, they can still go after her in other ways, seize other property, her wages, or whatever they can find to pay off that debt that she owed them. Well, a secured creditor is going to be in a superior position to other creditors who are unsecured when the debtor becomes insolvent. And insolvent just means the inability to pay your bills. If you have more money going out than coming in, sooner or later you're going to run out of money and you're insolvent. So let's look at another example to understand why this is true, why the secured creditor is in a better position. So Dave borrows money from the Bank of Goodman to buy his house. The Bank of Goodman takes a security interest in the house to secure this debt. Dave then borrows money from the Bank of Neosho to buy his car. The car itself is collateral for this debt. Then Dave wants to take a nice vacation, so he borrows money from the Flower Box Credit Union. This is an unsecured debt, which means there is no collateral to secure it. Then Dave goes broke and defaults, which means, of course, stops paying back all of his debts. So what happens next? Well, the Bank of Goodman can foreclose on Dave's house and sell it. Only if the sale of the house brings in more money than Dave owes the Bank of Goodman will any of the other creditors get any money off of this. So when it comes to the house, the Bank of Goodman has what we call priority with respect to that house. And so when they sell it, they're going to get all the money they need to pay off their own debt. And if there's any money left over, that can end up going to Dave's other creditors. But of course, usually that doesn't happen. But if it were to happen, if there was money left over, they could spread it around to the other creditors. And if there was any money left over, it'd go back to Dave. But that's probably not going to happen since Dave is broke. The Bank of Neosho, who loaned the money on Dave's car, they can seize his car, they can sell it, and then use the money to pay off what Dave owes on the car. Again, if the sale of the car brings in more money than Dave owed to the Bank of Neosho, then the other creditors can get to that money, use it to pay off their debts as well. Well, then we have the poor credit union here, who's an unsecured creditor. They have no collateral, and there is no piece of property that Dave has that has their name on it here that they can go seize because they're unsecured. And so they are only going to be able to get money from the sale of the house if there's some left over after the Bank of Goodman's paid off. They can only get money from the sale of his car if there's money left over after the Bank of Neosho is paid off. And so the credit union is going to have to cross their fingers and hope that Dave has enough other assets besides the house and car to satisfy its debt after the secured creditors are paid off. And so this poor little creditor here is the last in line. And so all these secured creditors are going to get to eat all this money to satisfy their debts before they have a shot at any of it. Having seen what a poor position that poor credit union was in, you might wonder, well, who has unsecured debt? Well, it's actually very, very common. Any credit card debt you have is unsecured. MasterCard doesn't have a security interest in your house or your car. Part of the reason the credit interest is so high on credit cards is because the companies are taking a risk. And by giving you that unsecured line of credit, they don't know when you go buy your groceries and your gas and, your trip to the casino or whatever you put on that credit card, they have really no security on that. They can sue you if you don't pay your bill, but they have no priority in any of your property. And so they'll hope that you have enough assets laying around that other secured creditors don't have an interest in that they can seize if you happen to default. And so that's why credit card interest rates are pretty high, because they're a little bit more risky because they're unsecured. If you go borrow money to buy real estate, including a house, that debt will almost always be secured by the property you are buying. And so if you buy a house, for instance, the creditor is going to insist normally that you put up the real estate that you are buying with the money they're lending you as collateral for that debt. So if you buy a house, that house is going to be collateral for the debt on the house. In most states, this security interest is going to be known as a mortgage. When you go to buy a house on credit, most people don't pay cash for a house. If you can, God bless you, but most people don't. And so when they go to buy the house, they will end up signing two pieces of paper. One of those is a promissory note, and we will hopefully look more about promissory notes down the line. But this is called just a note sometimes. It's basically a special kind of contract, but it's just you promising to repay the balance of the loan with interest. And so there's a contract there. They're saying they promise to lend you the money and you promise to pay it back with interest. Ta-da, we have a contract. It's called a promissory note. And so no matter what happens to the house, you're still on the hook for this debt. The other piece of paper that you're going to sign is the mortgage agreement. And that gives the lender that security interest in the real property that you are purchasing. And so if you're buying a house, this is what gives them the security interest in the house that will allow them to foreclose on your house and sell it if you end up defaulting. So if you stop paying on the note, And the lender can exercise its security interest in your property, as I said, by foreclosing on it and going and selling it. And the foreclosure process means that you're booted out of your house, and the lender takes the property and then can sell it in order to get back the money that it loaned to you. However, that mortgage isn't the only option they have. Since you signed that note, that contract to pay back the money, that makes the borrower personally liable on the debt. And so that means that the lender has options should the borrower go into default. They can certainly foreclose on the house, but let's say that the house is deteriorated, it's not worth as much money. If there's some difference left on the house, they have options because of this note that you signed. So normally, when somebody stops paying on their mortgage debt, and the lender is going to go take possession of the land, foreclose on it, and then sell it to recoup the balance that's due on the loan. But if that amount has not been repaid, even after that happens, the lender can sue the borrower on the note, is what we say, for the difference. So if the borrower defaults, he risks not only losing the land that was put up as security for the loan, but he's also personally liable and is going to be sued based upon the promissory note. So the lender who successfully sues on the note can get a judgment and then go seize other property belonging to the borrower. So not only, if the house that they foreclose on and sell isn't enough to repay the debt, they can go seize other property belonging to the borrower. So they can go get his car and his bass boat or whatever else he happens to own. They can also go garnish his wages and all that stuff to make up the difference that selling the house didn't make up. Before I get any further, I wanted to talk a little bit about some confusing terminology. It may just be confusing to me, but it's always tripped me up a little bit, so it might you as well. When we have this situation where somebody is borrowing money to buy real estate, and the borrower is called the mortgagor because he is the one giving the mortgage interest to the lender. And the lender is called the mortgagee because he receives the mortgage interest in the property. To me, this has always seemed backwards because it seems like the lender is the one in control of the situation, so they ought to be the or, and the borrower is the one, on their knees begging for something. They ought to be the e. But that's not the way it works because it's, we think, the lender is giving money to the borrower. Well, that's true, but the borrower is the one giving the mortgage interest to the lender. And so the borrower is the or and the lender is the e in this situation. So don't get tripped up by that. The security interest that the lender takes, the mortgage interest in the property, does not entitle the lender to possess the property unless and until the borrower defaults on the loan. And that makes perfect sense because, if you're making all your payments every month, you don't expect the president of the Bank of Neosho to crawl into your guest bed and spend the night because they have a security interest. They don't have any right to enter you into your property unless you violate the terms of the deal. So if you're still making your payments, the bank has no right to possess your property at all. But if you stop making those payments, that's when they can come in once you reach what's called default. Well, even though they don't have the right to possess the property until then, mortgage lenders do have a vested interest in protecting the value of the property since it's their security on the loan. Let's look at an example here to kind of illustrate this. Rufus gets a mortgage from the Bank of Stella to buy a beautiful scenic plot in the mountains that is covered in rare old growth forest. And so Rufus then proceeds to cut down all the trees for lumber and strip mines the land for coal, leaving a moonscape of craters and chat piles. The land is now worth 10% of what it was when Rufus bought it. The bank is upset because its security is now much less than it was. And we can see why this would be a problem because the Bank of Stella, when they loaned out this money to Rufus to buy this beautiful land in the mountains, they were thinking that, if worse came to worse and Rufus was a deadbeat and stopped paying his bills, they could go foreclose on that and sell it for what Rufus paid for it, if not more, and get all their money back. Well, now once Rufus has cut down all the trees and strip mined the land and left a bunch of nasty chat piles laying around, their security's gone, basically, because even if they foreclose on the land and resell it, they're going to be left holding 90% of the bag here for what he borrowed. And so you can understand why the bank would be upset in that situation. So the mortgage instrument often gives the mortgage lender certain rights with respect to protecting the value of the land. And what Rufus did here is called committing waste. When you're, cutting down the beautiful trees and, tearing up the landscape and all that, you may not be, wasting something like we would use in the vernacular today, but what he's doing is he's destroying the value of the land. And so that would be wasting the value there. So the mortgage instrument may in fact give the mortgage lender certain rights to protect the value of the land. Just depends on the situation there. In modern mortgage lending, lenders are always going to require the borrower to pay into an escrow account every month. And the money that goes into escrow is held by the lender in trust for the borrower. And so when you send your check into the mortgage company, it's going to be held in trust, and then they will kind of split that money up to do some different things, which is all in everyone's best interest. First, they're going to use the money that you pay in to pay your property taxes and to buy hazard insurance, such as fire insurance. Well, why would they do that? Well, this protects the lender from irresponsible borrowers who would otherwise neglect to pay their taxes or buy fire insurance. Well, what happens if you don't pay your taxes? Well, the county's going to come seize your land and sell it on the courthouse steps, and then you don't have your land, and the lender doesn't have any collateral, and so they're not going to want that to happen. So they will make you pay in a little extra with your mortgage payment every month, put that money in escrow, and then every year when your tax bill comes due, they will cut a check to the county you live in to pay your tax bill. And likewise, if the borrower doesn't buy insurance and the house burned down, the lender would lose his security on that too. And so they make you pay a little bit more on your bill when you pay your mortgage payment every month. And some of that money goes into the escrow account to pay your fire insurance, your homeowner's policy. And then that escrow, the people handling your escrow account will cut a check every year, whatever it is, to your insurance company to make sure that your bill gets paid. And so this protects everybody. It protects the homeowner too, although some homeowners are too dumb and wouldn't buy insurance or pay their taxes if somebody wasn't making them, but the lender will make them do that. And so you can kind of see here the lender protecting themselves by making this escrow account, making sure that these two very important bills get paid. That protects their security interest by making sure that the collateral doesn't burn down and not be insured or get seized by the county to pay your delinquent taxes. Let's talk a little bit now about different types of mortgages that you can have. The most common is a conventional, or what we call a fixed rate mortgage. The fixed rate means that the interest rate on this type of loan never changes over the life of the loan. So if it goes for 30 years, the interest rate is going to stay the same for that entire term. So because the interest rate doesn't go up or down, that means the amount of the monthly payment will never change. And if you've done any kind of work with finance or accounting or whatever, you'll know that when you're paying off a loan, you're paying principal and interest. And since the interest rate doesn't change, the amount of the monthly payment's never going to change either. And so that's good because you can plan your life around that. If you're paying the same amount every month for the life of the loan, you know what's expected of you. Commonly, the term on this type of loan is 15, 20, or 30 years. Theoretically, you could have something shorter, longer, or in between, but those are the ones that are commonly used today. Lenders are always going to, typically always, if they're above board anyway, will require a down payment, which is usually at least 10% of the purchase price on the property. Why do they do that? Well, it increases their security because the borrower is going to lose that money if they walk away and stop paying on the loan. And so without a down payment, the borrower would be able to walk away potentially without losing any money. So, if you go buy a house with 0% down and you haven't made your first mortgage payment yet, decide you don't like the house, you can just, get in your car and drive off and leave the bank with the house and an unpaid loan. And so to prevent that from happening, they kind of want you to ante up there when you take out your loan. So they will make you put some money down, typically. Well, that was a conventional fixed rate mortgage. There are also adjustable rate mortgages, or ARMs, and they will periodically change, or what they call adjust, the interest rate on the loan. And the amount of the monthly payments can then go up over the life of the loan because if your interest rate goes up, the total amount of the payment will go up because you're paying more in interest than you were before. So that principal plus interest amount ends up getting bigger. And so a borrower who starts off takes out the loan, starts paying off $1,000 per month, writing a check for $1,000. Once the interest rate adjusts, and if it goes up, he could end up paying $1,500 a month instead. So that's not usually a good situation to be in. And a few years ago, we saw that happen with what we call the mortgage crisis, where there were a lot of borrowers who probably should never have been approved for a loan in the first place, couldn't qualify for a conventional loan with the fixed rate. And so they ended up with an ARM instead. And when the interest rates went up, they suddenly couldn't afford the higher payments, and so they lost their homes. And that was a bad situation. Usually, it's a bad idea to get an ARM because you just don't know what's going to happen over a period of 20 or 30 years. You have no idea. Interest rates could end up getting really high. So in that situation, you could end up, your house payment could double or something, and then you wouldn't be able to afford it anymore. Nobody wants to be in that situation. So the only way that these usually make any kind of sense at all is if interest rates are really high at the time that you take one out, because if it adjusts, then it'll go down. And so back in the early 80s, interest rates were around 20%, and that's incredibly high. Now they're like 4 or 5%, something like that, or maybe a little bit more now. But they bottomed out a couple of years ago. So we're pretty low in terms of interest rates right now. But if you were buying a home in the Jimmy Carter years where the interest rates were 20%, it might have made sense to get an ARM because interest rates are going to go down eventually. And so that will adjust your mortgage payment, and your mortgage payment would probably go down over the life of the loan, but it's still a really risky move. And if you want to end up with a lower interest rate, if you get a fixed rate mortgage, you can just refinance the loan. And so you can take out a new loan to pay off the old loan and start making smaller payments at a lower interest rate. And so you don't have to rely on this ARM business. And so usually they're a bad idea, and home loans are usually only end up being taken by people who probably have bad credit and couldn't get a conventional fixed rate loan in the first place. So again, usually not a good idea. And as I said, borrowers with bad credit tend to end up with those non-conventional loans that adjust. Sometimes you'll hear the term subprime loan, which is usually an ARM with a fairly unfavorable interest rate. And again, these are offered to people who can't qualify because of bad credit for a better loan. And so they'll end up, if they want to buy a house, they'll get stuck with this nasty loan that has a high interest rate and adjustable rate to boot. Other subprime loans may include funky things like a balloon payment. And that's where the borrower pays a really low monthly payment for most of the life of the loan, and then at the very end of the mortgage, they'll have to pay the balloon payment, which is a massive amount of money that they still owe on the house. And even if you have 20 or 30 years to prepare to make that balloon payment, most people aren't good enough money managers to handle that, and so they will get into year 29 of the 30-year loan and realize they're going to have to make a $25,000 payment or something, and that's not going to work out real well for them. So most people usually avoid those sorts of things. Some of these subprime loans allowed the borrower to put down less than the 10% that we talked about. And so some of them even let you put zero down in exchange for a higher interest rate. And so if you didn't have any money in the bank and you couldn't qualify for a good loan, it sounded like a great deal. You could go buy this house, not pay anything down. You just had a high interest rate, and it would go on for a long time. Well, eventually that interest rate is probably going to adjust, because most of them are adjustable rate, and become unaffordable at some point in the future, and these people would lose their house. So again, a bad idea. And some of this has been cleaned up since we had the mortgage crisis in 2008 and 9 and all that, and they've kind of tightened up the rules a little bit on this stuff, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're still floating around out there. So beware if you go to buy your house and people are waving around these exotic loans with adjustable rates and balloon payments and nothing down and all that. You should be very suspicious of that. Sometimes the seller of the property will help finance the sale, and they will do that by accepting payments on the property rather than the full purchase price. And usually what will happen when you buy a house or any other kind of real estate is that the seller wants to sell it to you, you want to buy it, so you'll go to the bank, get a loan, and the bank will pay the full sale price to the seller. So they'll go walk away with a check for the full amount, and then you end up paying the bank for 20 or 30 years. And so the bank is the one waiting to get the money, and the seller will have it all right then. Well, in this arrangement, the seller is the one who's accepting the payments. And so basically you just cut the bank out of the equation here. And the seller will accept payments, of course, at an interest rate. And if they do that, that's called a purchase money mortgage. So that could potentially have advantages in certain situations, I suppose. A construction loan is a special type of mortgage loan, and that's used to construct a brand new building. And so you're not buying an existing building, you're taking out a loan to build a building. And most of these loans are structured so that the entire funds aren't paid out all at once, like you would if the house was already built. Instead, the lender will just make payments to the borrower as construction continues. And so, they might cut a check when you pour the foundation, they'll cut another check when you have to pay for the framing, and they'll cut another check when you have to get the roof put on, and so on and so forth. And so that limits the lender's exposure for as long as possible. Because if they gave you all the money to build the building up front, you might pour the foundation and then, hop on a plane to somewhere with no extradition treaty in Brazil or somewhere, and take the bank's money and never build this thing. And so they wouldn't have any collateral. And so they don't want that. So they might structure this. And so they're making payments at a particular time based upon the progress of the construction. And so that will end up protecting them a little bit that way. We also have a reverse mortgage, and that's used by elderly people to turn the equity in their home into cash. So they have some cash to live on. And what ends up happening sometimes, you'll have an elderly person who's made mortgage payments, for 20, 30 years, maybe even paid off their whole house. And so they're living in a mostly paid for house, but they have no money to go buy groceries or prescription drugs or whatever that they need to do. And so that amount of the loan that they've paid off, if they've paid off like 80% of the loan, that's what we call equity, that amount of the house that's actually been paid off. And so that's something they can basically borrow against. And so what they will do is they will kind of almost sell the house to this borrower, and the borrower will be making payments to the old person. Basically, they'll be turning their equity back into debt. That's what ends up happening. And so when the elderly person dies, the lender will be able to take the house and sell it and pay themselves back. And so that can be a way for elderly people who the only asset they really have is the equity in their house. They can turn that into cash to live on. And then when they die, the house gets sold, and sometimes they do that anyway. That would be a bad idea if they wanted to pass the house on to the next generation. So it works in some situations, for folks that need some cash to live on in their golden years. Also, you'll hear the term second mortgage. And this is used to describe a mortgage when the funds are used for something other than buying the property. In other words, we already have a first mortgage, which was used to buy the property, and then we end up with a second mortgage to do something else. Let's look at an example of when we would have this kind of situation. Jim takes out a mortgage, and this would be the first mortgage, to buy his house. 5 years later, he wants to remodel the kitchen, so he takes out a second mortgage to get funds to pay for that. So if Jim should happen to go broke, his first mortgage lender would get to foreclose on the house and pay off the balance on the first mortgage. Any funds left over will go to the second mortgage lender. And so in this situation here, that second mortgage lender is taking a risk because they don't know if there will be enough money left over after the house is sold to pay off both mortgages. And if the first one's the only one that can get any money out of the deal, they'll be left holding the bag. So they might have a higher interest rate on that second mortgage. In a mortgage where the borrower hasn't put a lot of money down, the lender might feel insecure, and we already talked about that. If the borrower doesn't really have any skin in the game, hasn't anteed up by paying a big down payment, they can walk away from the house and default and not lose a whole lot, at least not financially. Their credit rating would be all shot. But they're not going to end up losing much money on that situation. So to protect the lender in this situation, conventional loans require that the borrower purchase what is called private mortgage insurance, or PMI. And this is typically required with conventional loans where the borrower puts down less than 20% of the purchase price. And so if you're only going to put down 10% of the purchase's price as a down payment, for instance, you'll have to also buy private mortgage insurance, or PMI. And like any other insurance, this costs money. And so this will be included, the cost of this insurance, in your monthly mortgage payment. And so that your monthly payment will go up a little bit because you'll be paying for this insurance. And then basically it pays off the lender. If you do walk away from the house and leave them hold the bag, this insurance will kick in and pay the bank for whatever money they're out for you walking away. And so this is kind of deadbeat insurance for the bank. But once you've made enough payments to pay off that 20% of the principal, you can cancel the PMI. And so if you get to the point where you wouldn't have had to buy PMI in the first place, you paid off enough of your principal of your house, then they can go ahead and let you cancel that. So that's something that you run into if you can't make a big enough down payment. You may remember I said the security interests in real estate are called mortgages in most states. Well, Missouri actually isn't most states. We have what we call a deed of trust in Missouri. And this is a slightly different arrangement that does exactly the same thing as a mortgage. So almost universally throughout Missouri, I don't know why this was done. I'm sure it started in 1820 or something, and people just kept doing it. But anyway, we do it a little bit differently. And so it's a 3-person arrangement instead of a 2-person arrangement, basically, but the same thing happens. Let's look at an example here. Joe is buying Bryce's house, but is getting a loan from the Bank of Carterville to buy the property. At closing, the money provided by the Bank of Carterville will be paid to Bryce in exchange for title to the house. The title, however, will not be given to Joe. Instead, it will be given to a trustee, which is often a title company. The trustee will hold the title until the loan is paid off. Joe can live in the house, but he must pay money to the bank. If he pays the loan off, the trustee will then record a deed of release, which tells the whole world that the loan is paid off and Joe has clear title to the house. If Joe defaults, then the bank will notify the trustee, and the trustee will take action that allows the bank to start foreclosure proceedings. So again, it looks very much like a traditional mortgage thing, but we have not only the buyer and the seller and the lender, we also have this trust company that's here holding the title. Well, a deed of trust sounds a little bit complicated and weird, but it works just like a mortgage in practice. The whole idea is to give the lender security by not letting the buyer get clear title to the property until the loan is paid in full, by having that trustee in there kind of as the referee. But as I said, I'm not going to get too much more into the weeds here on this, but it works basically just like a mortgage. But if you go buy real estate in the state of Missouri and borrow money for it, you won't have a document called a mortgage in all likelihood. You will have something called a deed of trust. So that's what that is, so now you're familiar with that. Now we're going to change our focus to the unpleasantness that happens when people stop paying their bills. And inevitably, borrowers are going to default on their loans. It just happens. And borrowers who do this are usually completely broke. And there are often many creditors who are clamoring for their money, wanting to get paid. And so then we have interesting things happen with these creditors trying to get their money back. A mortgage lender will have a security interest in the real estate. And so they're going to usually have first priority in that asset. And so if somebody goes broke, the mortgage lender on the house is going to be able to foreclose on that house and sell it and get some money out of that. So at least they're protected in that respect. Occasionally, there will be fights between the mortgage lender and other interests. And we'll look at this later, but you might have what's called a mechanic's lien, or which is also called an artisan's lien, which are filed by contractors who do work on the property. So they might actually have a fight on their hands. And there, if you had some work done on your property and didn't pay your contractor, they usually actually get priority on stuff like that. But sorting out the priorities among creditors can get pretty complicated. Usually a mortgage lender will win in priority with respect to the land that's securing the mortgage. And so usually they will, if they loaned you money for the house, they'll get the house without any trouble at all, unless we have a mechanic's lien. But anyway, it does get pretty hairy sometimes, trying to figure out which creditor ends up winning these battles. It's kind of interesting too. I kind of enjoyed this when I studied it in law school. I'm not sure that you will. But anyway, we're not going to get too in-depth in some of these rules, but brace yourself, because sometimes it can get a little bit complicated. Many mortgage agreements will contain what is called an acceleration clause. And this is a language that takes effect on default when the borrower isn't paying their money back. And what it does is it makes the entire balance of the debt that's left that hasn't been paid back yet due and payable as soon as default occurs. And so let's see by example what can happen in this situation. Sally takes out a mortgage from the Bank of Carterville. It's a 30-year mortgage. It's year 2, and Sally gets behind on her payments and is in default. So she's not paying her bills. She's got maybe several months that she hasn't been paying her mortgage, and that's piling up. So she's in default. If the Bank of Carterville invokes the acceleration clause, that will make the entire balance of the loan, which is 28 years worth of payments on the principal, due and payable immediately. So stop and think about that for a second. She wouldn't have had to pay off some of this money for another 28 years, but because of the acceleration clause, as soon as she gets into default, she owes all of it immediately. And so she would have had 30 years to pay it off, or 28 more years, I guess, but now she has to pay it off today. Wow, that's kind of mean. Well, why do we do that? Well, this will allow the bank to foreclose and sell the property and pay off its entire obligation now and write off this bad loan. If we didn't have the acceleration clause, what would we have happening? Well, the bank would be sitting around for the next 28 years every month hoping that Sally is going to make her loan payment this month. And of course, she probably won't. And so every month it would have to file another lawsuit. Sally hasn't paid her mortgage yet, so we want our money, and we don't want that to happen. It doesn't make any sense. And so to kind of help the bank and keep the economy moving, we will force Sally, okay, you're in default, so we want all of our money right now, and if you can't pay it up immediately, we're going to foreclose. And so in practice, 99.99% of the time, someone who's broke and not making payments can't pay the whole thing immediately. So that just allows the bank to go ahead and foreclose, seize the house, sell it, pay off what's left of the loan, and move on. And so everyone gets basically a fresh start. Well, every state protects defaulting borrowers in different ways in situations like this, because it is kind of harsh. Somebody's taking your house and selling it out from under you here, even if it is your fault for being in default. And so we do have some mercy on people who are defaulting borrowers. One of those means is what we call the equity of redemption, and that'll give the borrower a second chance to keep the land even after default has occurred. The way this works between the time when the borrower defaults and before the property is sold in foreclosure. And so default has happened, but the property hasn't actually been resold yet in foreclosure. Well, then the lender must give the borrower a chance to redeem the property. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means if the borrower can somehow come up with all of the principal, interest, and other costs due on the mortgage, he'll get to keep his property and will be free and clear of the mortgage. And so this doesn't happen very often. But let's say that we had a borrower who had cash flow problems, and so they bought their house. They go into default because of their cash flow problems. The bank forecloses. They come to seize the house, but they haven't sold it yet. But then this poor borrower's ship comes in. They get a bunch of money, so they can march over to the bank and say, "Well, here is everything that's left on this loan, so give us our house back." And the bank has to do it. They have to take the money and give the house back. And so even though they've started the foreclosure proceedings, if it hasn't been sold yet, they have what's called the equity of redemption, where if they can somehow come up with all of the money that they're due to the bank, they can stop the bank from selling the house and get the house back and pay off the mortgage, and the bank has to let them do that. Along with the equity of redemption, many states give what they call a statutory right of redemption. The equity of redemption was kind of created by the courts way back in jolly old England, and equity, and it kind of gives you a clue into that. Well, there's also a statutory right in a lot of states where the state legislature has passed additional statutes to kind of give some safeguards to borrowers there. A statutory right of redemption will let the borrower who is foreclosed upon a certain amount of time after the foreclosure sale has been completed to come up with all the money that was due to the lender. And if they do, they can get the property back. And that's kind of an odd thing to let them get the land back from the person who bought it at the foreclosure sale. But that's what this statutes allow the borrower to do. Of course, the subsequent buyer, whoever buys this house on the courthouse steps, they're going to get their money back out of this deal. They just won't get to keep the property. And so the original owner who lost it has a certain amount of time after the foreclosure sale to go to the person who bought it at the foreclosure sale and get it back if they pay off all of this money. So it's kind of an odd situation, because if you go buy land at a foreclosure sale, and you do so knowing that there's a chance, maybe a remote chance, but there is a chance that the previous owner may redeem the land and that you will have to give it back if they come up with all the money. In most states, that's just a year or less, but that's still quite a risk to be taking. You know, if you buy land at a foreclosure sale, you don't want to go build some fancy department store on that land right away, because there is a chance that the original owner could get that land back within a year if they can somehow pony up all this money that they owed. So anyway, kind of a weird deal. So if you buy land on the courthouse steps, just kind of beware. Well, the foreclosure process is what we go through when somebody has been in default. The mortgage lender is trying to get that property back. And technically, what the foreclosure is foreclosing upon is the equity of redemption. They will cut off the equity of redemption. And so the end of the foreclosure process is when the equity of redemption stops and the original owner can't get it back again through the equity of redemption. And so the mortgage lender will use this legal process to take possession of the land and sell it to satisfy the balance of the debt. There's a couple of different ways that the lender can go about this. The first one, and the most popular, is also the traditional method that we call judicial foreclosure. As you might have guessed from the word judicial, it involves going to court and dealing with a judge. And so what happens is the mortgage lender will file an action to foreclose on the property in court, and then the court will supervise the entire process from start to finish. The object of filing this action in court is to get the court to order a public sale of the property to satisfy the debt, and the court has the power to do that. And this is typically carried out by the county sheriff on the courthouse steps in the form of an auction. And this will happen sometimes. There are people that try to go get good real estate deals doing that, and I guess sometimes it works for them. So a lot of times the bank that actually loaned the money will be the one that buys it back. But anyway, this is how that process usually works. If the auction doesn't bring enough money to satisfy the balance due on the loan, then the lender will get what's called a deficiency judgment against the borrower for the rest. And this is the judgment that's based on the promissory note that the borrower signed. Because remember, you sign two pieces of paper. One is the mortgage that lets them foreclose on your house and sell it for whatever it's worth to pay off your bad debt. But if that's not enough, they can sue you on the note and then have a judgment against you for the rest, and they can go seize your other property, your house, maybe your vacation house, I don't know, your bass boat, your car, whatever else you have, garnish your wages to make up the difference from what they couldn't get back from selling your house at the foreclosure sale. We saw what a judicial foreclosure looks like, and that's the norm. That's normally what's going to happen when a foreclosure is taking place. But we do have an alternative to that called a non-judicial foreclosure, which is also called a power of sale foreclosure. And this allows the lender to take possession of the land and sell it after there's a default without any court supervision. And this is agreed to in the mortgage document itself. And so when the mortgage interest is given by the borrower, and they will agree to this up front, that if they default, that the lender has the power to come in and take possession of the land and sell it without actually going to court. And so this is agreed to in advance. Well, it can be great if it works. It's cheaper and quicker than a judicial foreclosure. Anytime you can avoid going to court and paying lawyers lots of money, that's going to be preferable to the alternative. But it's still not very popular by and large, because lenders are wary of getting clear title to land through a procedure that takes place outside of court. Because what will happen is you have to be very careful when you're snatching somebody's house away from them, or their business or their land or whatever it is. And so you have to be very careful that you have all your I's dotted and T's crossed and follow the rules. And so if you're being supervised by a court, if there's ever a question about that, you can just ask the judge, and the judge will make a ruling and kind of oversees the process and make sure it complies with the law. But if it's going on outside the court process and somebody gripes about what's going on, and it's not being court supervised, that can become problematic. And what they'll might very well end up doing is just filing suit and getting it dragged into court anyway if they're unhappy with the way this process is unfolding. So it can end up being even more of a headache than judicial foreclosure if something goes wrong. And so that can be a problem. And another problem is that subsequent buyers of the property might be afraid that the lender, when they did this non-judicial foreclosure, mess something up with the procedure. And if they do that, that would potentially cloud the title, which just means, put some kind of legal question mark on the title about, what the rights are of the people who own it. And so if they don't own it free and clear, if there's a cloud on that title, that's going to make it harder to sell the land. Because if when you go buy land, you don't want to buy a lawsuit to go with the land. And so you might be afraid if you're a buyer coming along and, you're looking at this house and, oh, by the way, this just went through a non-judicial foreclosure. There might be some question marks in your mind about, was that properly conducted? Is the original owner who lost the house going to maybe file suit and try to get the house taken back and I will lose it? And so people don't want to buy a lawsuit. And so that can become problematic. And as I said, there might be a situation where the borrower who's losing the house or land or whatever it is might end up filing suit anyway. And so by and large, I think that most lenders still would rather go through the judicial process for a foreclosure, even though it can be lengthier and more expensive, just because it's cleaner in a way and there are less question marks along the process, and it can end up being less trouble in the long run. Sometimes you'll have a situation where a borrower sees that they're in trouble, that they're not going to be able to keep up with the payments, they're getting close to default, and so they will, before they actually do default, they'll work with the lender and work out an alternative that's called deed in lieu of foreclosure. When this happens, the borrower just hands over the deed of the property to the lender and walks away. And so they basically throw in the towel and say, I'm never going to be able to keep up these payments. Here, you take the property, lender, and they give up on it. So the borrower will lose the property, which they would have anyway after they defaulted and were foreclosed upon, but they avoid the whole foreclosure process. And that helps the borrower a little bit on their credit report because the deed in lieu of foreclosure doesn't look as bad as an outright foreclosure. Probably it's not good, but may not be quite as bad. Also, it helps the borrower because the lender in this arrangement will agree not to seek a deficiency judgment against the borrower. And from the lender's perspective, it's a good thing because it avoids the time and expense that comes with the foreclosure proceeding, and they end up in exactly the same place except for the deficiency judgment. So they end up with title to the property. They can sell it, to repay the debt that's still owed to them. And the only negative aspect of that is they can't go after the borrower if the property doesn't sell for enough to cover the debt. And so a lender will only agree to this probably if the borrower is not what we say underwater with their house, which it means that as long as they don't owe more on it than it's worth. If they, the lender might agree to that anyway if they do owe more than it's worth, but they know they're going to take a little bit of a bath when the property doesn't sell for as much as is owed on it. But anyway, so this is kind of good for all the parties. It's quicker, they stay out of court, it's cheaper, and may help them both out in different ways. Yet another alternative to a foreclosure is what we call a short sale. This happens when we have a borrower who sees that he's not going to be able to keep making payments on the mortgage, he's getting close to default, and the property has declined in value. And so now it's worth less than the balance that's due on the loan. As I said, we call that underwater sometimes. At that point, the borrower can ask the lender to accept a short sale. Well, what this means is that the borrower will go out and find a buyer for the land who's willing to pay what the land is worth, which now is less than the amount that's due on the note. And so they're willing to buy it, but they're going to pay less than is still owed on it. Well, if the lender agrees to this, they will take the purchase price as full satisfaction of the loan and write off the remaining balance. And so if, let's say that the borrower still owes $150,000 on his house, he finds it's declined in value, it's only worth $120,000 now, but the the borrower finds a buyer who's willing to pay that $120,000, the lender agrees to this, so they'll sell it for $120,000. The lender will take that $120,000, write off the $30,000 difference as a loss, and everyone moves on with their life. Well, this helps the borrower out because it will ding their credit rating again, but probably better than a foreclosure. The lender's going to lose some money, but it'll probably still be cheaper than it would to actually go through a foreclosure. And you never know, selling a house that's been foreclosed upon sometimes can be a risky deal too. The people who are getting kicked out of the house may, bust out some windows and, tear up some carpets and stuff on their way out. Sometimes they're upset and they do things like that. And a lot of people don't want to buy a house at a foreclosure sale. And so anyway, this can be a better situation for everybody. Kind of avoids the whole foreclosure process. Now we're going to look at what we call mechanics liens and materialman's liens, because these can cloud title to your property, and they're all just a kind of a different sort of security interest. This is a type of security interest that's filed by people who do work on your property or provide material for work on your property. So we were talking about, contractors, people, who build on an addition or remodel your kitchen or that sort of thing, usually. They can acquire a security interest in your real estate where they made these improvements, wherever they're doing their work. The people who perform the work, like the contractors, they can get what's called a mechanics lien or an artisan's lien, while the people who are providing the parts or materials, the lumber, the heating system, a new kitchen sink, whatever, who provide that stuff, they get what's called a materialman's lien to make sure that they get paid. There's a specific process for them to follow when they get this lien on your property, and it has to be recorded with the Recorder of Deeds office. And so this is just a mechanism to make sure they get paid. Until they get paid, they can keep this lien on your property, which will cloud your title. And so, if you have them remodel your kitchen and sell your house and forget to pay your contractor, there's going to be a lien out there, so they can swoop in and get the money that they're due. The person filing the lien is called the lien holder. They can actually foreclose on the property just like a mortgage lender could if the bill's not paid off and they follow the proper procedures. And so if you have your house remodeled, you don't pay your contractor, they get this mechanics lien on your house, and you refuse to pay them, eventually they can foreclose and sell your house so they get paid, just like your mortgage lender could. It's just, again, a safety mechanism for them, so they get the money that's due. After they file this lien, once the bill's paid off, the lien holder has to file what's called a release of the lien with the Recorder of Deeds office. It clears up the title to the property, so there's no cloud on it if you go to sell it, because whoever's buying your property ought to have somebody do a title search, make sure that you actually own the property and it's marketable. And if there's one of these mechanics liens floating around, that's going to mess that up. So they have to clear that title up before they go ahead and release the lien there. Now we're going to move on to a slightly different topic. We've been talking about real property and security interests in real property with mortgages and the like. Now we're going to switch gears and move into security interests in personal property. Of course, we know what personal property is, things that we can move around. Well, a lender can take security interest in personal property just like a mortgage lender can take an interest in real property. Same kind of idea. When personal property is used as collateral for a debt, that's what we call a secured transaction. And the good old UCC, our old friend, we looked at Article 2 in nauseating detail for several weeks. Well, there's another article, Article 9, of the UCC, which covers secured transactions and deals with this kind of stuff. And again, just like mortgages on real property, the creditor in a secured transaction, if you default on your loan, they can seize the personal property and sell it in order to satisfy the debt. So same basic idea. A secured transaction can actually involve just two people or three. And so we'll look at some examples here to kind of see how both of these situations can work. In our first example, we have just two characters here. We have Jeff, who wants to buy a welder for his business. He finds a welder he wants at Saginaw Industrial Supply, hereafter known as SIS. It costs a lot of money, but Jeff wants to buy the welder and SIS wants to make the sale. So Jeff buys the welder on credit, and so he'll be making payments to SIS for this welder until he pays it off. SIS takes a security interest in the welder and allows Jeff to make payments and buy the welder on credit. If Jeff defaults, SIS can take the welder back to satisfy the debt. So again, very much like what we would see with a mortgage, only here we're dealing with a piece of personal property and this welder. Let's have another example here with three parties. Here we have Kyle who wants to buy a jet ski, but he doesn't have the money. He finds a jet ski he wants at Stockton Marina. Kyle goes to his local credit union and takes out a loan to buy the jet ski. The credit union takes a security interest in the jet ski and will be able to seize it to satisfy the debt if Kyle defaults. The credit union pays the money to Stockton Marina, and Jeff goes home with the jet ski. So here, Stockton Marina is selling this piece of equipment, but they're out of the transaction here at the end. They get all their money from the credit union, and so they drop out of the transaction. And so as soon as the sale is over, it's just Jeff and the credit union. And so Jeff is going to be making its payments to the credit union. The credit union will retain the security interest in the jet ski until the loan is all paid off. When we talk about a secured transaction, basically any type of personal property can be the basis for that. We have our old friend goods, and we know what those are, tangible items of personal property that we can move around. We also have intangible forms of personal property, things like stocks and bonds, stuff like that, which wouldn't qualify as a good, but still personal property. Even intellectual property like patents and copyrights could be the subject of a secure transaction. They could be used as collateral to secure the loaning of money in some way. A business can even use its accounts receivable as collateral, which are the outstanding bills to customers who owe the business money. So probably some of you know more about accounting than I do, but never was my favorite subject. But you probably know what accounts receivable is. It's just basically the bills that are owed to your business by your customers. And so those are property that you can use as collateral for a loan, interestingly enough. We also have another interesting kind of concept that we can use for collateral, and that is inventory. And that's the goods that the business keeps in stock that it intends to sell customers. So you walk into Walmart and everything that you see sitting on the shelf, that is their inventory. Now, inventory is a little bit weird because a creditor who has an interest in a business's inventory doesn't know what specific goods it has an interest in from one day to the next. Because Walmart, they are selling stuff and restocking the shelves all day long. So each day, the business sells some of its inventory while receiving shipments of new inventory. And so one of my law professors explained it like this. It's like a river. If you go to the Mississippi River, there's always new water that keeps flowing down the river, but the river always is there. And that's how inventory is. A business always has inventory, but it's flowing through the business. Their old goods leave when they're sold to customers, and new goods show up on the loading dock in the back. And so it's a continual flow. And so at any given instant in time, what the goods that actually constitute the inventory are going to be different than they were the moment before, will be the moment after. But you can still take an interest in that inventory. And so if you happen to foreclose on a business's inventory, and try to snatch it to pay off the debt, you don't know what exactly you're going to end up with, but you're going to get whatever the business has there on the shelf in stock to sell to customers. So kind of a little bit of a different idea there. Article 9 sets out the rules for how security interest in personal property can be created. And there are really two options mainly to look at. The first is the creditor can actually take possession of the property in order to get that security interest. And the classic example of this is a pawn shop. And if you ever had to pawn anything, you go in there, you get a loan, but you have to leave your property with them in order to secure that loan. And of course, if you don't pay it off, then they stick it on the shelf and try to sell it to somebody else. So if the creditor has possession of your property, that can create the security interest. And then you don't even need a written agreement for that. If you have an oral security agreement, that's going to be enforceable, which is kind of odd. The second option, rather than do it that way, is just have a written security agreement. So the borrower can retain possession of the property, but there's some kind of written agreement that creates this security interest. To be valid, this written security agreement has to have four things. First, it has to clearly describe the collateral so you'll know exactly what it is. Again, with inventory, we can't identify each particular good, but we can identify which store's inventory and what the inventory generally will consist of and that kind of thing. It just has to be reasonably definite and certain so we'll know what we're talking about here. Second, it has to state that the debtor promises to repay the creditor and include the terms of repayment, things like interest rate and when payments are due and that sort of thing. Third, has to state what the creditor's rights are if a default occurs. For instance, has to define, the fact that the creditor can come get the collateral and go sell it. So it has to spell all that stuff out, exactly what happens if something goes wrong. And fourth, it has to be signed by the debtor. And so just kind of like a contract has to be signed by the party to be charged to be valid against them. Well, same idea here. It just has to be signed by the debtor if you're going to hold the debtor to this agreement. So those are the 4 different things we have to have for a valid written security agreement. And in order to use property as collateral, the debtor has to either have a legal right to own it now or have a right to own it sometime in the future. For instance, again, going back to inventory, a debtor might not own a particular item today, but next week he knows the truck's going to show up and he'll get some more inventory delivered and have it sitting out on the shelf. And so, when if a store owner borrows some money, uses his inventory to secure the loan, at the time that he signs that document, he probably doesn't own the stuff that will get seized if he stops paying his bill 6 months from now. But he will have the legal right to own it later, and so that's good enough. He can pledge it as security for the security agreement. If the requirements of a security agreement are met, the 4 things we looked at a slide ago, then the security interest will attach to the collateral. And that's a term of art, which means that we have a valid security interest and it's now stuck on that property. And so that property is encumbered by this interest, just like a mortgage would cloud the title to your house. Well, this is attaching to your collateral, and it's on there like a tick. It's stuck, and you can't get rid of that security agreement until you pay off the loan. And so this means an enforceable security interest has been created with respect to the collateral. If the debtor defaults, the creditor has the legal right to seize the collateral to which the interest is attached in order to sell it and satisfy the debt. So let's look at an example of where this could happen. Here we have Jill, who is a general contractor who wants the money to expand her business. She reaches an agreement with the Bank of Lamar, which agrees to lend her money in exchange for a security agreement in her equipment. The agreement clearly states that Jill has borrowed $100,000 and that the collateral for the loan will be Jill's backhoe, her bulldozer, and her 2 work trucks. The agreement also states that Jill will pay 9% interest, that payments will be made monthly, and that if Jill defaults, the bank has the right to seize the collateral and sell it to repay the debt. The agreement is signed by Jill. So do we have a valid security agreement? Well, first, does it clearly describe the collateral so we'll know exactly what it is? Well, it talks about her backhoe, her bulldozer, and her 2 work trucks. That sounds pretty definite and certain to me. The second requirement, the debtor promises to repay the creditor and include the terms of payment. Well, and here the agreement says, yeah, she's going to repay it, 9% interest, monthly payments, and so on and so forth. And the third thing, it has to state what the creditor's rights are if a default occurs. Well, this specifies if Jill defaults, the bank has the right to seize the collateral and sell it. Fourth thing, it has to be signed by the debtor. Well, this says it's signed by Jill. So here it appears we have a valid written security agreement, which would attach to these items of Jill's equipment here. So that would secure this debt. It's not unusual for a security interest to attach to property that the debtor doesn't own at the time that the security agreement is signed. And we mentioned this earlier with respect to inventory. So let's look at an example and kind of make this clear how this could happen. Let's say we have a car dealership who signs a security agreement that uses its inventory. And of course, that's going to be the car sitting on its lot as collateral. It signs the agreement in 2005. If the agreement's still in effect in 2010, the agreement will still be attaching to current inventory. In this case, that would be 2010 model vehicles that weren't even manufactured at the time the agreement was signed. We refer to collateral that the debtor doesn't own until after the agreement is signed as after acquired property. And that's a special term that we use in that situation. And this is kind of interesting. Remember, the inventory is like a river that's flowing through the business. Well, here, We have those big old trucks, hauling these new cars to this car lot. And as soon as they pull into that car lot and the dealer accepts delivery, then boom, there's magically this security agreement attaches to those cars because they become inventory. Well, then somebody shows up and buys one of those cars and drives it off the lot. That security interest automatically detaches and disappears because it's no longer inventory. Someone bought it. It's been sold to a customer, and then that security agreement will attach to the cars that show up to replace the ones that were sold, and so on and so on. When a security interest can attach to after acquired property like that, it's called a floating lien. And so, as you can imagine, the security agreements spirit kind of hovering over the car dealership and attaching to all the new cars that are delivered and detaching from the ones that are sold. It's kind of floating around, waiting for new property to show up. And so that's the situation where we have a floating lien. And again, inventory is a kind of a classic example of that. But inventory is not the only type of after acquired property that we could have. For instance, there could be proceeds from the sale of collateral. Let's go back to one of our previous examples, kind of show how that would work. Say that in our previous example with Jill the contractor, she signs the agreement, and then a year later she sells her backhoe for $5,000. The security agreement will automatically attach to the money she receives from the sale, so that if she defaults afterwards, the bank will automatically have a security interest in $5,000 in Jill's bank account. So if the backhoe or the bulldozer or whatever turns into something else, if she traded in her bulldozer and got a track hoe or something, that would be after acquired property. It would automatically attach to perhaps. Sometimes we'll have a situation where, a business will have one of these floating liens that'll attach to other stuff that you get from the same business too. Those rent-to-own places, which, by the way, are a big ripoff. You should avoid those. But if you go to one of these rent-to-own things and you get a couch and they take a security interest, there may be a provision in there that gives them a floating lien over anything else that you get from the store too. So if you go back the next day and get a microwave, that'll automatically attach to that too. And then if you default on the couch, they can come get both the couch and the microwave and stuff like that. So anyway, these are not that uncommon to have these sorts of interest in after acquired property. So it will automatically attach to new collateral that way. Now we're going to talk about perfecting a security interest, which is a little bit different than attaching. We've already seen that and how it can attach to property. Perfecting is kind of an extra step that gives the lender even more rights and kind of puts them in a better position. So when it comes to understanding Article 9, creating the security interest and getting it to attach to the collateral is kind of the easy part. In a way, that's pretty straightforward. The interesting stuff happens when it comes to establishing priority among creditors when a debtor becomes insolvent, because usually what happens, somebody goes bankrupt. It's kind of like where you have a carcass of a dead cow and you have all the buzzards circling. That's what the creditors will be like, and who gets to land on the cow first and have dinner is kind of what we're trying to figure out. And so how we determine the priority among creditors can become a very complicated problem that we're going to kind of dip our toes in the water a bit and just kind of see what the issues are, so you'll have a good understanding if, God forbid, you ever end up in that situation, either have people circling over your corpse, or perhaps you loan money to somebody for something in your business and they go broke, and there's other lenders out there too. You'll kind of understand what's going on. So let's look at an example here to kind of see what can go wrong. All right, let's go back to Jill here, the general contractor. And she gave a security interest in some of her machinery to the Bank of Lamar, and later takes out another loan from the Bank of Nevada, which takes a security interest in Jill's quote-unquote equipment. Well, this interest is not just in a few pieces of equipment like the first equipment. I mean, remember, the first security interest was in a backhoe, I think a bulldozer, and 2 work trucks. Okay, very specific pieces of equipment. Well, the second security interest covers all her equipment, so it would include things not covered by the first security agreement. So her circular saws, concrete mixers, her nail guns, whatever else a general contractor has laying around to do their work. However, her equipment, quote unquote, would also include things that were in the first agreement, her backhoe and her bulldozer, for example. And so what happens if Jill goes broke and the Bank of Nevada and the Bank of Lamar both have a security interest in some of the same property? Because, she goes broke, there's her backhoe sitting there, and the Bank of Lamar will say, hey, we have a security interest in this backhoe. And the Bank of Nevada says, well, I don't care. We have a security interest in all her equipment. And so, it's bank versus bank here, trying to figure out who gets to take the backhoe. So to determine which bank gets it, we'll have to go back to Article 9 and sort out which bank has priority. In other words, which one gets to have a first crack at the backhoe. And figuring out priority is a major part of Article 9. In order to get priority over other creditors, a creditor with a security interest must perfect that interest. And so just having it attached isn't enough. We'll have to perfect it in order to secure our place in line and to get the backhoe once Jill goes belly up. There are different methods for perfecting a security interest, but the idea is to put other potential creditors on notice that the debtor's property is already encumbered by a security interest. And so basically, imagine, a little kid, running up to a brand new bicycle and grabbing onto it and saying, mine, mine, mine. That's kind of what the creditors are doing. They'll run up to Jill's backhoe and say, mine, mine, mine. And, so if she goes belly up, the whole world knows that they get first crack at it. Kind of what we're doing here. And again, putting out the whole world on notice is important, because it wouldn't be fair to creditors if a debtor could go out and put the same piece of property up as collateral 6 different times to 6 different creditors without letting the creditors know about one another. And so this whole system we have of establishing priority is trying to encourage creditors and to kind of let the whole world know about their interests, and so we don't have those kinds of misunderstandings. One way to perfect a security interest is simply to take possession of the collateral. Usually that's impractical. We saw how a pawn shop can do that. You take your guitar in there, or your hunting rifle or whatever, and pledge that in the pawn shop. They'll give you some money and they'll keep the goods. And so if you default on your loan, they'll go sell it. Well, that's one way of doing it, but usually that's impractical. For instance, if the Bank of Lamar had taken possession of Jill's heavy equipment, her backhoe and her bulldozer and her 2 trucks, well, she wouldn't have been able to do the work that she needed to do in order to make money to repay the loan. So that would just kind of be shooting itself in the foot. If the Bank of Lamar made her park her backhoe at the bank parking lot and keep it there until she had paid it off, well, how she's going to pay off the loan? She can't do that if she's not using the backhoe. So that doesn't work very well. So the more usual way to perfect a security interest is to file what we call a financing statement. Now, this is a pretty standard form that Article 9 talks about, but each state will implement this because it's a uniform law, so they'll kind of do it their own way. But each state will maintain some sort of office which accepts financing statements for filing. The financing statement will contain the name of the debtor and the creditor and describe the collateral, which is the subject of a security agreement. So it's going to, plainly say, who's owes the money, who's lending the money, and what this financing statement is going to, what the collateral is that has a security interest attached to it. So the financing statement will say all of those things. Well, then when a debtor applies for a loan, what the lender should do is go check with this office and see if there have been any financing statements already filed in that collateral. So in other words, in the example that we saw earlier where Jill had 2 security interests from the Bank of Lamar and the Bank of Nevada, well, what should have happened was the Bank of Nevada, before they issued that second loan, would have gone and looked it up and found a financing statement from the Bank of Lamar that said that the bulldozer and the backhoe were already encumbered by another loan, and so they would have known that going in. So if they had gone ahead and loaned the money, they'd have done that with their eyes wide open. So anyway, that's how this system is set up. So I go into this office and looking, you can see if anyone else has loaned money to your borrower before you lend them money, so you will know before you get into a big mess. Let's look at an example of how this is supposed to work. Ricky owns a lawnmower dealership and wants to borrow money to expand his business. He applies for a loan from the Bank of Dadeville and proposes to use his inventory as collateral. The bank gets on the internet and checks for any other financing statements that Ricky has signed. So they'd go to that office's website, whatever it is in the state, and look to see if he's had other financing statements issued with respect to this same collateral. The bank discovers that Ricky already took out a loan last week from the Bank of Stockton, which used his inventory as collateral. Since the Bank of Stockton perfected by filing the financing statement, the Bank of Dadeville knows that if it loans Ricky the money, its security interest in his inventory would be in second place, behind the Bank of Stockton's interest. The Bank of Dadeville refuses Ricky's loan application. So here uh, because the first bank had actually perfected by filing a financing statement. They put the whole world on notice. They have dibs on Ricky's inventory if he goes broke. And so the Bank of Dadeville, sees that and like, uh-oh, we don't want to be second in line. And so they turn down his loan application because he's trying to pledge the same collateral to two different banks. And so they catch on to that because of the system that we have in place. And so that's how it's supposed to work. Well, perfection in establishing priority is extremely important if you're going to be a creditor because, frankly, when somebody goes broke, they probably don't have much money. And so if you're not first in line, the odds of getting much are pretty slim. And so establishing your priority is very important. Let's look at another example here, building on our last one, to kind of see what can go on in these kinds of situations here. Ricky applies for a loan at the Bank of Stockton using his inventory as collateral. And the Bank of Stockton gives Ricky the loan, and Ricky signs a security agreement. However, the Bank of Stockton, unlike our first example here, this time the Bank of Stockton, changing our facts a little bit, forgets to file a financing statement. Next week, Ricky goes to the Bank of Dadeville and applies for a loan. The Bank of Dadeville searches for any financing statements with Ricky's name on them, but doesn't find any because, of course, the Bank of Stockton forgot to file it. So the Bank of Dadeville gives Ricky a loan with a security interest in his inventory. The Bank of Dadeville files a financing statement perfecting its security interest. So let's pause there for a moment and kind of take stock of what's happened. The Bank of Stockton, they loaned Ricky the money. Ricky pledged his inventory as collateral. So if he signed that agreement, then it attached. And so we already had a security interest attached to Ricky's inventory. The Bank of Stockton did that. Okay, but they didn't perfect. And so the Bank of Dadeville, they will search for any financing statements with Ricky's name on them. They don't find it, so they go ahead and give the loan. They have another agreement that is presumably signed, a security agreement. And so as soon as that's signed, the Bank of Dadeville's interest attaches. And so we have two attached interests, but then the Bank of Dadeville takes us an extra step. They go and file the financing statement, put the whole world on notice. That perfects it. And so even though they were second in time to attach, they were first to perfect. So let's see what goes on after this, because a year later, Ricky goes broke and defaults on all of his loans. So the Bank of Stockton and the Bank of Dadeville discover that they both have a security interest in the same collateral, which is Ricky's inventory. The Bank of Stockton has a security agreement that was signed before the Bank of Dadeville's. So it attached before Dadeville's did. However, it never perfected its interest. Even though its security interest attached after the Bank of Stockton, the Bank of Dadeville perfected first by filing a financing statement. Thus, the Bank of Dadeville will get to seize Ricky's inventory and sell it using the money from the sale to pay off Ricky's loan. And so priority goes to the person who perfected first, not the person who attached their interest first. And so that's very important. If there's extra money left over from the sale after the Bank of Dadeville gets through with it, then the Bank of Stockton will get paid. But otherwise, the Bank of Stockton will be like an unsecured creditor. We'll have to hope that Ricky has enough assets left over after all his secured creditors are paid off to get some money. And so the Bank of Stockton really screwed up here. They ended up second in line in the buzzard circling over Ricky's corpse here. They're going to have to wait for the Bank of Dadeville to get done here with this because their interest attached first, and it's just a crying shame that they didn't go perfect it first, because if they had, then they would have had priority, and then the Bank of Dadeville would probably never given the loan in the first place, the second loan on the same collateral. But since they didn't do that, the Bank of Dadeville is going to get priority because they perfected first. And so again, that's very important to go ahead and perfect your interest. So I can't really emphasize that enough. It's important to perfect a security interest because a creditor's priority dates not to when the security agreement was signed, which is when attachment would happen, but when to perfection occurred. And so if you're looking at situations where you have multiple creditors, a good rule of thumb is, it's kind of easy to remember, kind of a little song almost, priority dates to perfection or filing the financing statement, whichever comes first. If you can remember that, that's usually helpful in figuring out what happens when you have this cloud of creditors circling over a debtor's corpse trying to figure out who gets to eat first. Priority dates to perfection or filing, whichever comes first. So that's normally the way that it works. But anyway, so remember, taking out the loan or signing the security agreement doesn't determine priority, perfection does. And so if someone has perfected, they will beat somebody who attached before they did if they didn't perfect. So again, very important to go through the motions here that Article 9 requires you to perfect that security interest. Well, a financing statement is good for 5 years once it's filed in the office that you need to file in your particular state. Once the debtor pays off the debt, the creditor has to file what's called a termination statement with the same office, which tells the whole world that the debtor has paid off the loan and that the creditor no longer has a security interest in the collateral. And so that would allow you to sell your bulldozer or whatever else you've pledged as a security interest free and clear, and kind of unclouds the title to that. Well, filing a financing statement is one way to perfect a security interest. There are some other ways too. We're going to look at one here that where perfection happens automatically if the seller of goods finances the sale itself. Let's look at an example here. Say that you go to Wally's Electronics and you want to buy a TV. Wally has a special deal. You don't have to pay all the money now. You can buy the TV on credit and make monthly payments to Wally. So you buy the TV and Wally becomes your creditor. Well, Wally also gets a security interest in your TV, and Article 9 says that's automatically perfected. He doesn't have to go file a financing statement in order to perfect that, since he's the one selling you the TV there. And this is called a purchase money security interest, and it's a little bit special. And so it's since it's automatically perfected, Wally doesn't even have to go file a financing statement to get priority with respect to your TV. He still could. It would probably still be a smart thing for him to do, but he doesn't have to. So when you're buying something like this, and the seller is your creditor, they've already perfected their security interest in the property that they're selling you. Well, priority becomes very important in dealing with people who are broke, because debtors who go bankrupt, they usually will have multiple creditors. They often have conflicting security interests in the same property, and figuring out who has priority can get really, really tricky. So if you're delve into this, don't get too wrapped up in all these priority rules. They're extremely complex, and certainly I'm not going to ask you to master all of them. I'm going to give you a few just to kind of give you an idea of how this area of law works, because it is something that businesses commonly enter into one way or another, either as a borrower or the lender. So I'll give you kind of a taste of this, but again, this is where you call your attorney if you have major problems in one of these areas. So I'll give you a few priority rules and just kind of show you how it works. So looking at our basic rules here, first of all, a secured creditor always beats an unsecured creditor. So if you have, for instance, an unsecured creditor, the credit union just gives you a signature loan, you sign the agreement, say, I promise I'll pay it back, and they give you $10,000, and you walk away with the $10,000, but they don't have anything, any kind of security interest in your property. Well, a secured creditor is always going to beat that, because, if the bank loads you money on your car, they have a security interest in your car. Well, the credit union is never going to be able to beat them to your car. The bank will always get priority in that car. So a secured creditor with a security interest that has attached to your property is always going to beat an unsecured creditor that just, has some kind of unsecured debt with. So secured always beats unsecured when they go head to head there. Well, if neither creditor has perfected a security interest, the one whose interest attached first wins. And so let's go back to our prior example where we had the Bank of Stockton and the Bank of Dadeville there. Well, in our example, the Bank of Stockton didn't perfect. They attached first, but they didn't perfect. The Bank of Dadeville attached second, but perfected first, and so the Bank of Dadeville wins. Well, let's say that the Bank of Dadeville had not ever perfected either, and so we had these two banks with conflicting security interests in the same collateral. Well then, if nobody perfected, we'll just go see whose interest attached first. And that's who is going to get priority. So if nobody perfects, then whoever attached first is going to win. We already saw, though, in that example, that a creditor with an interest that is perfected beats a creditor whose interest is unperfected. So if we have two creditors whose interest is attached to the collateral, the one that has the interest that is perfected will beat one who has not perfected. And we saw that happen with these two banks. The Bank of Stockton was first, but they, their interest attached first, but they never perfected it. So the Bank of Dadeville attached second, but perfected first. And so they got to beat the Bank of Stockton. So that's how that works there. Anyone who's perfected will beat someone who's unperfected. However, if two creditors have both perfected, then priority goes to who perfected first, and that makes sense, doesn't it? You know, back to our example and changing the facts again, if the Bank of Stockton had perfected, then the Bank of Dadeville perfected second. We'll just go with who perfected first. So first come, first serve, and it kind of makes sense there. So those rules are the big ones, and using them, you can usually figure out which creditor gets priority based on them. At least get some pretty good idea. In real life, it gets really, really complicated sometimes, but lots of litigation has happened over this, but those general rules kind of help you understand how the system is designed to work. So those are general rules. With any other general rules are exceptions. We'll look at one here. So here's our exception we're going to look at. I'm going to call it the garage sale rule. I don't know if anyone else does or not, but it makes sense to me, so that's what I'm calling it. This happens when we have a buyer of secondhand consumer goods who gets the goods free and clear of a security interest unless that buyer has actual or constructive notice of the security interest. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's look at an example here. Sarah buys a TV from Wally's Electronics on credit. Wally gets a purchase money security interest in the TV, which perfects automatically. So he has a security interest that attached and is also perfected. So he should have priority in this TV for the as opposed to the rest of the world out there. Sarah has a TV for 6 months, but she falls on hard times. She sells a TV at a garage sale to Jerry and stops making payments to Wally. When Sarah defaults, Wally wants his TV back. However, Jerry bought the TV without any notice that Wally had a security interest in it. Wally cannot get the TV back from Jerry and has to sue Sarah and is basically in the position of an unsecured creditor. Okay, so in this situation, it looks like that poor Wally here did everything he should have. He automatically got a security interest attached in this collateral, which is a TV, and it automatically perfected. That's what you're supposed to do, isn't it? You know, have your security interest attached and then perfect it. But here he is getting stiffed and can't get the TV back from the person who bought it at Sarah's garage sale. So looks like he's getting the shaft here, but this is an exception. But he could have prevented this from happening if he had been just a little bit more careful. So what if Wally had filed a financing statement? Well, he didn't have to file a financing statement, remember, because it perfected automatically. But if he had done so anyway, that would have put the whole world on constructive notice of his security interest. Well, what in the world is constructive notice? Because clearly this guy who bought the TV at the garage sale had no idea that there was a security interest attached to it. Well, constructive notice, and if you see the word constructive in a legal setting, that just basically means the court's making something up. Well, here, the court is making up a notice. Constructive notice means that even if someone didn't go to the trouble to look up the financing statement and find out about it, that they could have. And so, to be fair to everyone, the law will treat them like they did know about this, whether they actually did or not. If this person shopping at the garage sale had actually known that there was a security interest, that's what we call actual notice. But he didn't have actual notice. And since Wally hadn't filed a financing statement, he didn't have constructive notice either. And so he was under no notice, so he gets the TV free and clear of the security interest. Well, if Wally had filed a financing statement, even though he didn't need to perfect his interest, remember that, he would have been going above and beyond. Well, then if he had done that, he would have put the entire world, including Jerry, who bought the TV at the garage sale, on notice that Wally had a security interest in Sarah's TV. So Wally would have legally had the right to go and get the TV from Jerry at the time that Sarah defaulted, if that had happened. So in the real world, how often is somebody going to go file a financing statement on a television? Probably not that often in a situation like this. But they could if they wanted to, and if they did, they would be protected in a situation like this. Well, now we're going to talk about what happens when somebody who is loaned money out and has a security interest, what happens when their borrower defaults? What happens there? How can they make things right? What are the remedies that are available to them? And if somebody, of course, fails to live up to the obligations of the security agreement, that means that they are in default. Usually, default happens when the debtor stops making payments on the debt. So 99% of the time, that's how default will occur. It could happen in other different ways, but that's normally what we're talking about. When a default occurs, a creditor actually has several different remedies. Of course, they could just sue for the amount of damages that they're due, but normally they will be exercising their rights on the security interest and trying to get the property back. And that's what we're going to focus on when we look at these, at how this happens going forward. So our favorite remedy for default is what we call taking possession of the collateral. This is often called repossession, or in the vernacular, a repo. So if you buy a car and stop making payments on it, somebody with a tow truck usually comes and gets it. That's a repo. Once the collateral has been repossessed, the creditor can either keep it or the creditor can sell it and then use the proceeds to pay off the debt. If the creditor chooses to keep the collateral, he will take it in full satisfaction of the debt, and that means that he'll write off the entire debt if he keeps the collateral and doesn't try to resell it. So he can't keep the collateral and then go demand extra money from the debtor to make up the difference. So if they repo your car and say, well, this car is not worth as much as you owe on it, if they keep that car rather than try to resell it, they can't come after you for the difference. And so they have to make that choice. If they do sell the collateral, the creditor is under an obligation to use good faith. In other words, they have to use their best efforts to get the highest possible price for that collateral, because if the collateral sells for less than the amount of the debt, they have the right to come back to the debtor and have him make up the difference out of pocket. And so they have a duty to make sure they get as much out of the sale of this collateral as possible. So sometimes that's actually come into question. Did they auction it off on the courthouse steps? Did they advertise it in the paper? Did they try to get word out to all possible buyers? How much work did they actually go to try to get the best price for something? So sometimes that can actually be an issue, but a creditor has a duty to use their best effort to get the highest possible price out of the collateral when they're trying to resell it. So still talking about what happens when they take possession of the collateral. When they do have that sale of the collateral in order to make up the money that is owed on the debt, the creditor will take the proceeds from the sale. And the first thing they're going to do with that money is pay their own expenses in connection with repoing the collateral and conducting the sale. So, they will maybe give a percentage to the auctioneer. They may have to pay some attorney's fees for going through this repossession process, because there is a process you have to follow or you can get in big trouble legally. There may be, commissions or, whatever they have to do to pay the cost of the sale. That's going to come out first. Next, the proceeds of the sale are going to be used to pay off the debt that the debtor owed the creditor. And so if your car gets repoed, whatever you still owe on the car, first off, we'll pay the cost of actually conducting the sale. The next thing, we will try to pay off the debt that's owed on the car. And so that's the second thing that this money is going to go toward. Then, if there's anything left after that, it goes to any other creditors that have lower priority. So let's say that you had a car loan, but then you also got some other kind of debt that you put your car up for collateral on. That was like a second mortgage on your car, basically, that was in a lower priority. So if there's any other debts like that out there, those other creditors would then be able to come in and get whatever's left over. After that, after we pay the expenses of the sale, we paid off the original debt and any other debts that are owed with respect to that collateral. After that, if there's any money left, it goes back to the debtor. And of course, normally there's not going to be any money left, because if there was that little left on the note or on the loan, probably the debtor would have figured out some way to pay it off without having his car repoed. But anyway, if there were anything left over, it would actually go back in the debtor's pocket. And as we said, most likely the proceeds from the sale won't be enough to pay off all the debt. So we won't even get past step 2 of that. If that happens, the creditor can sue the debtor and get a deficiency judgment for the difference. And so if you owe $10,000 on the car, but at auction the car only sells for $7,000, then the creditor can come sue you for the $3,000 difference, and that's called a deficiency judgment. And they don't have any security interest to back that up. They'll just have to go try to find other assets of yours or bank accounts or garnish your wages or some other thing. Basically, they're in the position that an unsecured creditor would be with respect to that deficiency judgment at that point in time. So let's look at an example where this would occur. Andy takes out a loan so he can buy a car for $15,000. The car dealership finances the loan and takes a security interest in the car. Andy goes broke and defaults on the car. The dealership repos the car, then sells it. However, the sale only brings in $12,000. The dealership can sue Andy and get a deficiency judgment for $3,000. The dealership can then use the judgment to seize other assets of Andy to satisfy the debt. After a creditor has repoed the collateral, but before the sale, the debtor has the right to redeem the collateral. We saw this equity of redemption in real estate, and it's a very similar concept here. And so in other words, if somehow after the car has been repoed, if the debtor can scrape together enough money to go pay off the entire debt, then he can get his collateral back, just like we saw with equity of redemption with real estate. The same kind of reasoning applies here. So probably that's not going to happen. If the debtor is having things repoed, he's probably in dire financial straits. No one else is going to loan him money, but if his rich uncle comes in and gives him a bunch of cash, he can go redeem that collateral before the sale. Earlier, we talked about a mechanic's lien in the context of real estate. If a contractor does work on your house, they can put in a mechanic's lien, until they get paid off. But those also exist with respect to personal property also. And usually they have first priority above all other secured interests, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. We don't want those folks to get the shaft, and probably whatever they did, whatever work that they perform, actually added value to the collateral. So it makes sense that they should get compensated for that. Let's look at an example. Julia buys a car on credit, and Pineville Motors has a security interest in the car, which it perfects in order to establish its priority. Julia takes the car to Nick's garage to be worked on. Nick does the work, but Julia doesn't pay her bill. That's because Julia has run out of money and can't make her car payments either. Pineville Motors wants to repossess the car. However, Nick has a lien on the car for the value of the work that he did. Nick's lien takes precedence, even though Pineville Motors' lien is properly perfected first. Nick will get to sell the car and pay his bill off, and any excess goes to Pineville Motors. And so in this situation, the mechanic can kind of cut in line and get in front of the person that originally had a perfected, the first perfected security interest on the car. So that's another exception and kind of those rules that we were looking at. And again, you can kind of understand the public policy reasons behind that. Probably, if it's a broken down car, it's not going to be worth as much anyway. And so this work that the mechanic did that added value to the collateral, and it would be unfair for this original lender to profit from that and then stick the mechanic with an unpaid bill afterwards. And so just to be fair, we kind of let the mechanic's lien cut in line there, the priority. Well, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. There's one more topic that I wanted to cover while we're talking about debt, basically, that I thought you should know something about, and mainly because you need to avoid it at all costs. But that's the subject of surety. Well, a surety is a person who voluntarily becomes liable on a debt owed by another person. How in the world does that happen? Well, normally, oftentimes, we see this when somebody co-signs for someone else on a loan. And you've probably heard about this before, but let's look at an example where this happens. Katie wants to buy a car, but she has no money and bad credit. The bank won't give her a loan, so she convinces her grandma to co-sign on the loan. The bank gives Katie a loan, which grandma co-signs. The bank is willing to do this because grandma has good credit, and she now becomes just as liable on the note as Katie. Of course, we know how the story is going to end. Katie is a loser who doesn't work and won't pay her bills, which is why she had a bad credit rating in the first place. Katie stops making her car payments and leaves the state with no forwarding address. The bank can then sue grandma for the full balance due on the loan. So when you have a surety, the person who co-signs on the loan becomes just as liable on the note as a primary borrower. So even though Katie's the one getting all the benefits of this, she gets the car. It's grandma is just as much on the hook as Katie is when she co-signs that loan. She has become a surety, so she will make sure that the creditor gets paid in the event that the primary borrower hightails it to Mexico or something. Well, banks are usually very eager to lend money because that's how they make a living. They want to make loans. So if they are refusing to lend money to somebody, unless that somebody gets a cosigner on the loan, that's usually a very good sign that the person who's the primary borrower there is unlikely to pay off the loan. Banks have an uncanny way of predicting things like that. So usually when you have a cosigner, it doesn't always happen, but if you ran the percentages, there's a good chunk of the time they're going to get left holding the bag. And so poor grandma is going to get screwed in this deal, usually. because the person probably shouldn't have had a loan in the first place. And so, once in a while, somebody will, become a superhero and come through on that and be able to pay off the loan. But if they needed a cosigner in the first place, it's a really, really bad sign. So, my word of wisdom as we close is that there are very few certainties in life, but this is an exception. Co-signing a loan is always a dumb idea. So I don't know what to tell you if you have kids that are clamoring and want you to co-sign a loan for them at some point in your life, but I'm afraid the best thing you can do is tell them to get lost because it's better to get by with a crappy car and get a job and save money and then be able to go buy something yourself than it is to get somebody to co-sign a loan with you, because that is how friendships and family relationships and those kinds of things get very, very stressed. Money tends to drive people apart more than it brings them together. So that's my word of wisdom. Avoid co-signing loans for people. Don't be a surety. So with that said, we have covered our material on debt, secured interest, all that kind of stuff. Hope it was at least a welcome break from studying contracts. So I will let you go and look forward to seeing you again next week.